Hello everyone, GoldenNova here and, well, Snake Rain. Released on August 15th of 2007, almost 14 years ago at time of recording, this simple spell has since garnered something of a reputation. Initially released as part of a suite of generic reptile support in unison with the Venom archetype, this -2 of a spell has been firmly wedged into the minds of every mad scientist deck brewer who has ever seen it, asking one eternal question: what archetype will break Snake Rain? And it seems that the developers, maybe a little too zealously, have leaned into that particular line of thought with one of the themes to be released in Ancient Guardians, Abhyss, a reptile archetype with effects that revolve around the graveyard, and the more you can dump in there, the better. Now, at first glance, I thought this was an Egyptian-themed archetype associated with the cycle of life and death. You know, light and dark attributes, sending and summoning to and from the grave, golden armor covering some kind of dark mass beneath, but I'm glad I questioned that assumption. They are still Egyptian, but the Abhyss are actually based off of, per the Wikipedia page, the Ogdoad, a group of 8 primordial deities that personify the inherent qualities of the primordial waters of chaos. I don't think I can do it all justice here, but I encourage you to look up more about the Ogdoad if you have time, it's super interesting. For now, let's plumb the depths to see what cards we have available, decipher the ancient writings to see how they operate, and see if there are any helpful drops that we can add to this particular ocean. It's time to scale things up with Abhyss. But before we continue, a quick reminder to please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed my content so far. We're on the road to 5,000 subs and you can help make it happen. Once we reach that lofty goal, I'll be making Heroes Explained, covering everything from Contrast Hero Chaos to Extra Hero Wonder Driver, and every related monster, spell, and trap in between. We've also got our Discord, where we talk about one of the greatest JRPG characters of all times, Ricky the Hero Pawn, and a Twitter where you can stay up to date on channel news and my bad takes. Thank you all so much for watching, and now, back to the video. So what's the deal with Abhyss? Well, there are a series of light and dark reptile monsters, usually they come as a pair of both, and several of them let you trade cards from your hand or field to bring them back in some way, as well as sending cards to the grave or gaining you advantage, but at the cost of letting your opponent get monsters out of their grave, though we thankfully have a few ways to counteract that. Let's start with Null, Dreg of the Abhyss. They're a light level 4 monster with 0 attack and defense, and you can send them from your hand to the grave to send a dark reptile from your deck to the grave. Also, if you control no monsters, or you control an Abhyss monster, you can special summon Null from the grave, but it's banished once it leaves the field, and you can't special summon any monsters while it's on the field, except for reptiles. Now, there aren't a lot of good targets for its Foolish Burial effect outside of the theme, but it still makes for some fantastic setup, as well as some quick fodder for summoning out your level 8s. And while it does suck that it'll be banished after its revival, you could just make King of the Fair Limps with it. It is a reptile for some reason, and can search you any reptile monster you want. I don't know why they called Null a Dreg, because it seems pretty integral to the game plan so far. Their pair is Nile, Dreg of the Abhyss. They're a level 4 dark monster with 0 attack and 2000 defense, and they can be sent from the hand to the grave to send a light reptile from your deck to the grave, which sets up the other half of your deck quite nicely, including some aliens or worms you might be playing. Also, when normal or special summoned, you can add an Abhyss spell or trap from your deck to your hand, and let me tell you, we've got some doozies. The only thing I'm not a fan of is that it can't search you a Black Lotus, cause considering the card art, it feels appropriate. Our next pair is the Crocodile Twins. They're both level 4 and share an effect. If they're in the grave, you can send a card from your hand to the grave to add them to your hand. The first one is Flogi, Haze of the Abhyss, a light monster with 1800 attack and 1400 defense. If they're sent from the field to the grave, or special summoned from the grave, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls and a monster in their grave with an equal or higher attack. Then, you special summon the selected monster to your opponent's field, and if you do, you send the other targeted monster to the grave. It's an interesting effect that is thankfully optional. Now, there may be some corner cases where you can trade a monster with a powerful effect for one with higher attack points but a less useful effect, and it doesn't specify how you have to summon it, so if it's not a link, you can just summon it in defense position if that's better for you, and it does send, so as long as it can be targeted, it's going to bypass a lot of protections, but the problem is that it doesn't even negate the effects of what you summon, and in a game where decks are built so every monster counts, it'll be hard to find one that isn't going to help your opponent, not to mention that it requires your opponent to actually have a monster in the grave strong enough to make this effect live. There's a lot to not like about Flogi, I admit, but trust me, it gets better with the context that comes later. Alligator. Zoa, Haze of the Abyss, is a dark monster with 1500 attack and 1700 defense. If they're sent from the field to the grave or special summoned from the grave, you can have your opponent draw a card, and if they do, you add an Abyss monster from your deck to your hand, then each player sends a card from their hand to the grave. This one's a little more useful than Flogi. While it's basically just Dark World dealings, it's not necessarily a minus depending on the circumstances, and the card you get is a search, so you'll know what you're getting, and it helps set up your graveyard to boot. While the future of any given hand may be obscured, Zoa's here to help clear away some of the haze. Alright, now it's time to talk about our level 8s, and the first pair of them is Curse and Aelith. Both of them can be special summoned from the grave by tributing one monster you control, at which point you give your opponent something as well. They also have an effect that triggers on being special summoned from anywhere, including from its own effect. First is Curse, Dawn of the Abyss, a light monster with 400 attack and 2400 defense. And when you use its effect to summon it from the grave, your opponent special summons any monster of their choice from the grave, but thankfully its effects are negated. When special summoned, you can target and special summon a level 4 or lower Abyss in your grave, but it's banished when it leaves the field. So you both get a monster, and while your choice is very limited, yours gets to keep its effect, meaning Nile can grab you a spell or trap, Zoa can search you a monster, or Flogi can do its weird replacement thing. But whatever you have ready, it's a nice way to get into your higher costed monsters, and it's rank 8 material to boot. I just hope you've resolved Snake Rain by then and have a loaded grave, cause otherwise it'll be a horrible board state for a curse. Aelith, Dusk of the Abyss, is a dark monster with 2000 attack and 800 defense, and when you use its effect to summon it from the grave, your opponent can add any monster from their grave to their hand, letting them recoup things like hand traps and starters. And when Aelith is special summoned, you get to return 2 of your banished monsters, at least one of which being a reptile, back to your grave, which can help mitigate all the banishing that happens in the deck. But really, any monster, huh? Talk about your Gillosaurus setups. You might want to pack a few soul releases to keep their grave empty, because otherwise these effects would kick butt. But as it is, you're just gonna have to be careful and watch how you use all these effects, from dusk to dawn. Thankfully, this is the end of our monsters giving your opponent free stuff, and now we can start punishing them for it with our next pair of level 8s, Aaron, King of the Abyss, and Amunicia, Queen of the Abyss. Both of them can also be summoned from the grave, though they require 2 tributes, but thankfully don't have a beneficial effect for your opponent. Aaron, King of the Abyss, is a light monster with 2500 attack and 2800 defense. If your opponent adds any number of cards from anywhere to their hand, except during the draw phase, you can send a random card from their hand to the grave. Also, if any number of monsters your opponent controls are sent to the grave by a card effect, yours or theirs, you can add a light or dark reptile from your deck or grave to your hand. Now this is what I'm talking about. You get to rip a card out of your opponent's hand after resolving Zoa or Aelith, and search a card when resolving Flogi's effect. And all of these can be activated independent of those setups as well. I mean, drawing and searching is something a lot of decks do, so now you just have a Dark Law for it. And on top of all that, I'm gonna have a lot of fun saying "King me" every time I summon them. Amunicia, Queen of the Abyss, is a dark monster with 2700 attack and 2100 defense, and if any number of monsters are summoned from your opponent's grave, you can send any card your opponent controls to the grave. So it's non-targeting removal that can trigger from Flogi and Curse, but note that it doesn't care what side of the field the monster is summoned to, just that it's summoned from your opponent's grave. Keep that in mind for later. Also, if any number of monsters are sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the grave, you can special summon a light or dark reptile from your grave. Now these are some pretty nifty effects, and I like how King and Queen bounce off of each other. For instance, if your Flogi swaps a monster on your opponent's field, Amunicia then sends another card they control to the grave, maybe even the monster you just summoned, and then Aaron can search you a card. And if your opponent drops a monster out of their hand after Zoa's effect, Amunicia summons you a new monster from the grave, and Aaron sends another card from their hand to the grave. Talk about getting the royal treatment. Our last monster is our biggest boss, Ogdoadic, Deity of the Abyss, and they're in a league all their own, though I wouldn't be surprised if we got a dark counterpart for them down the line. They're a level 10 light monster with 3100 attack and 2200 defense, and if they're in the grave, you contribute 3 monsters to special summon them, and once while they're on the field as a quick effect, you can send all monsters on the field to the grave, except any monster that was special summoned from the grave, and if you were running the deck like a good steward of the Waters of Chaos, then it won't be a drawback for you. Now, 3 monsters is a pretty hefty cost, I admit, but Ogdoadic doesn't have any restriction on how you summon them, so any card that can do so is fair game. In fact, Reanimator effects are super good for the entire deck, so pack your Monster Reborn, your Back to the Fronts, even your Viper's Rebirths, because all of them give you a field wipe with an enormous attack stat. With a deity this good, Novamojis is going to have some competition. Alright, now it's time for our spells and traps, and the first one is Snake Lily of the Abhyss. It's a normal spell that sends a reptile from your deck to the grave, then if you have 5 or more reptiles in the grave with different names, you can special summon any reptile from your grave. This pairs obscenely well with Snake Rain, setting up the summon of any reptile monster. And even if it doesn't, it still sets up your grave with any of your on-theme monsters to help your play sequences bloom. Depths of the Abyss is a field spell that has an effect that triggers when any number of your face-up reptiles you control are destroyed by your opponent, letting you target any card they control and sending it to the grave. Also, if Depths is destroyed by an opponent's card effect, you can mill your opponent for cards equal to the number of reptiles with different names in your grave. So the first effect provides a bit of insurance if your opponent starts blasting your monsters, and the mill effect can trigger Amunicia's effect to summon a monster from the grave, but it's just so reactive. Trust me, we've got another field spell that'll work wonders later on, but for now, just know that this field spell is way out of its depths. Invasion of the Abyss is a normal trap that special summons 2 Abyss tokens to your side of the field, which are Dark level 2 reptiles with 0 attack and defense. However, if you happen to have 8 or more Abyss monsters in your grave that have different names, and remember we currently only have 9, you can instead special summon 2 reptile monsters from your grave with different names. It is nice that it gives you some tokens to use, but since it is a trap card, I'm not really a big fan. Unless, of course, you can consistently load up your grave with the requisite monsters for its alternate effect very quickly, because it's an incredible way to enable King, Queen, and Deity, but that would require about 2 activations of Snake Rain, so it may just be a good singleton to search off of Nile when you need it. Otherwise, it's just going to end up being a token effort. Our last card is Emptiness of the Abyss, a continuous trap that, during any main phase, allows you to tribute a reptile effect monster you control to target a monster in your opponent's grave and special summon it to your field, but send it to the grave during the end phase. Also, if Emptiness is face up in the spell and trap zone and sent to the grave, you must send all non-reptile monsters you control to the grave, which, yeah, isn't really that big of a deal. It's certainly no Eternal Soul. The important thing is that it doesn't negate the effects of the monster you summon, so you can borrow some of your opponent's effects for a little bit before giving it back to them. You also have the option to swipe a monster out of your opponent's grave after it's been targeted for an effect. Another nifty thing is that this triggers Amunicia's effect to send an opponent's monster to the grave, because it was technically special summoned from your opponent's grave, so this helps give you some quick effect speed removal. Be very careful when fighting opposite this card, because stuff like this can really send ripples across the format. So that's all the Abyss cards, but what do we do with them? Well, it's hard not to file this deck into the control category. We have a few big beaters, but nothing that turbos them out aggro style, and some of our best effects punish our opponent for accruing advantage and can just straight up wipe the board. Add in a few cards to stifle our opponent and make our own effects even more profitable, and we'll slither into the winner's circle soon enough. So what can we play to help them out? First, let's do a quick rundown of generic reptile support that you might have missed. As noted previously, Snake Rain is integral to the deck. It immediately sets up all your boss monsters for revival and improves both Snake Lily and Invasion. And if you want to play some Chaos monsters, then hey, all the better. Viper's Rebirth summons a non-tuner from your grave as long as all the monsters in your grave are reptiles, but it is destroyed during the end phase, so you know, use it wisely. Offerings to the Snake Deity is just a nifty 2-for-2 exchange that can take out a number of problem cards, and damage equals reptile seems fun, but just isn't enough. Sure, any amount of damage can summon Nile for a search, but it's almost too telegraphed to be useful. You'd be better off running Alien Brain. W Nebula Meteorite is an interesting choice, I'll grant you that, if only for the fact that it can summon Ogdoadic and King during the end phase, but it seems too slow and high rolly to be worth the inclusion. What about synergies with existing reptile themes? Abhyss certainly seems generic enough to allow for it. Well, worms are right out. Flip effects aren't really in the cards for us. Aliens and their A counters aren't very useful either, but there are a couple of fun picks. You could use your Foolish Burial effects to set up an Alien Ammonite play to make Cosmic Fortress Golgar, bouncing spells and traps back to the hand to fuel its removal effect, but that's a bit too janky for me, and I've played Dream Mirror. Alien Shock Trooper M-Frame though is much more up my alley. The 8 counters don't do much on their own, but it does vent a reptile out of our hand, and if destroyed by anyone, you can special summon non-link reptiles from your grave with different names, up to the number of monsters with 8 counters your opponent controls. Even just dumping a level 4 monster means you can tag up to 4 of your opponent's monsters, so you can go into a huge float after their destruction. So I guess we know what the M in M-Frame stands for. Value. What about Reptilands? Well, a lot of them don't make the cut, but we do have a few we definitely can't ignore. Lamia can just zero out the attack of a monster, though at the cost of some life points, and if sent to the grave as synchro material, because they are a tuner, you get to zero out 2 more monsters, and this pairs splendidly with their synchro, Hydra. Tune Lamia with any of your level 4s, and you can layer your triggers so you can pop 3 monsters and draw 3 cards. And you can make even more valid targets for that effect with Echidna. They're just as easy to summon as M-Frame, if not more so, zeroes out another monster on summon, and can add reptile monsters with different names from your deck to your hand for each monster your opponent controls with 0 attack, and your search only gets better if you've resolved Lamia that turn, with the only restriction being that you can't special summon monsters from your extra deck except reptiles the turn you search. Oh no, whatever will we do? But I can't delay talking about this card for much longer. A card that seems custom built to work with this archetype, second only to Snake Rain, and that's Lair of Darkness. The attributes of your snakes on field don't really matter, so that's not really an issue, and it lets you use your opponent's monsters for the in-grave revival effects of your bigger Abhyss. It also gives you tokens that, if they survive, can be used as tributes as well. Splash in Arima to search Lair, or use their other effect to search for Queen or Nile, and even play Darkest Diablos for another big beefy boss monster that, when combined with Lair, can actually make use of the monsters you give your opponent with your Abhyss effects. As for a silly tech pick, I think Mask Change 2 fits the bill quite well. I mentioned earlier that Aaron was kind of a Dark Law, but it's even better to have the real thing. We've got plenty of level 4s to use as material, and if we can get them out early and often, then we don't really need to worry about our opponent's grave for any of the downsides. It just doesn't exist. And that's all I have to say about Abhyss. I think the makings of a great deck are here, with a lot of powerful grave synergies that make strong bosses and set up punishing boards, and I think it'll only get better from here. Adamancipator was also built on an underserved type, and a number of core sets came along to bolster it to make it a tier 1 threat, and I think it can happen again here. And let's not forget that Generator was initially scoffed at because it allowed your opponent to draw a bunch of cards, but it's since evolved into a powerful rogue strategy. But it could be that I just love decks that treat the grave as a second hand. I've got a burning desire to play some Abhyss. But now, I want to hear what you all think. Do you agree that these sinister serpents have what it takes to send our opponents to their final judgment, or are their effects just a little too watered down? Let me know in the comments, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video around. It really does a lot to help me out. And if you want to see another deck that harnesses the powers of light and dark, check out this video I made about Dream Mirror. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.